Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If you would kindly take your seats. What is in store. The next session is, as on the screen here, CTBT 101, Political and Legal Framework. We're calling it 101 because the purpose of this session is to either provide those who are maybe less familiar with the CTBTO with a grounding in the background to the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, to the organization, to the history of nuclear tests, and for those who are more aware of the CTBT and its provenance, to provide a little recap on some of those issues. We're very well aware that there's quite a diverse group of people here. There are some people who have had careers on CTBT-related issues for many years. There are others who are newer to it, so I hope that we have something here that will be of value to all of you. Secondly, we delve a little bit more deeply into some of these issues by looking into understanding the CTBT, the scope, obligations and compliance with the treaty, which will be a session run by our Chief of Legal Services in about an hour's time. And finally today we will have a session on the Preparatory Commission and the future organization, which will be run by Bozorgmehr Ziaran, who is the Acting Chief of External Relations and is also the Secretary to the Preparatory Commission. So that's what we have in store today. We're going to start, as I said, with CTBT 101, Political and Legal Framework. And if I could just say hello to all of those joining us online. This is the first of the sessions that is going to be streamed. And I hope it will also be saved for posterity, so if you miss out on anything, recordings will eventually be available for you to look back on. I think we can move on to the presentation. So, CTBT 101, Political and Legal Framework. If you didn't catch my name earlier, it's Cormac O'Reilly. I'm from the External Relations and International Cooperation section. And this is an overview of what I would like to achieve together in the next hour. We're going to look into a little on the history of nuclear testing, the development of the non-proliferation regime, the treaty in detail, well actually not in too much detail because there will be another session immediately afterwards which can go into a bit more detail. We will have a preview of the verification regime. There will be a number of sessions during the course of this week and also next week on the specifics of the verification regime, so I don't think that we need to get into an incredible amount of detail, but we can at least go through some of the main elements. And then we will begin the discussion on the political challenges. And I'm sure that even those of you who are less familiar with the treaty realize that there are certain political challenges surrounding it. This is going to be the topic of conversation and discussion in a number of the panels that we will have this week. where we will drill down to specific issues and look at the CTBT's political challenges from different political contexts, different regional contexts, and so on. But maybe today this afternoon is a good point to start thinking about that. We will have a look into recent developments in disarmament and non-proliferation and also consider what these might mean for the CTBT. Again, some of these more recent developments will be the topic of discussion later in this week and next week. And finally, I'll say a few words about building momentum, and this links to what we had this morning, spreading the message, looking for force multipliers to increase the momentum and interest in the CTBT. So we're going to start with a little bit of history, looking back on the history of nuclear testing and where the CTBT came from. History of nuclear testing. So where to begin? Where do you think is a good in looking at the history of nuclear testing? Where would you begin? Sorry? You can press the microphone button.
I think the starting point is the treaty test, which was in the United States of America.
Very good. Any other views? Yeah. So there seems to be a lot of consensus here that when discussing the history of nuclear testing, one should start at the beginning. Well, I'm not actually going to start at the beginning. I'm going to start right now. Because sometimes I think you need to look at the present in order to see where we've come from. This is a quotation by the Executive Secretary, Dr. Nasima Zerbo, who you will meet later in the week. And it is in response to very recent developments. So, at a press conference the other day, the Executive Secretary stated as follows: "I'm encouraged to see reports that the DPRK Permanent Representative to the Conference on Disarmament declared his country's intention to join international efforts to ban nuclear tests." Was anyone here aware of this statement that was made by the DPRK representative? Had you heard this? Why is that significant, do you think? No views? Well, there's a simple answer, and you all know it, don't you? There's only one country that has been conducting nuclear tests. No, please add to it. Add to it.
Well, I guess the reason nobody answered is because it's so obvious. Yeah, as you said, North Korea has been the only country in about, what now, 30 years, possibly, that has tested nuclear weapons, other than Pakistan, I think, was the last one before that.
Yeah, you're certainly on the right track. Not quite 30 years, but we're this is this is the kind of information that's going to come out during this session, and that will help us all have this sort of common basic knowledge as we go forward. So yes, I mean, you're quite right. It is obvious. And secondly, it's this is the reason why it's quite an interesting statement. But look at the nuance here. What do you think this means, join international efforts to ban nuclear tests? Do you think that this means that the DPRK is going to sign and ratify the CTBT?
I think because they are also contribute to take another country also to join the international effort test ban nuclear test. Not they just join, but they are also contribute in it, in my opinion.
Okay. Well, this is something we can come back to later in the presentation, because now we are going to go into the past. But just bear this in mind a little bit about what it means to join international efforts to ban nuclear tests. Now we're going to look at how we got to the current situation, the history of nuclear testing. And you were quite right. The place to start otherwise is with the Trinity test. So you all know already the Trinity test was the world's very first nuclear test. It took place in 1945, just before 5:30 a.m. on July 16th, 1945, to be precise. And it took place in New Mexico in the United States. And what was the purpose of conducting this test?
It was to see if the bomb that had been developed to end the Second World War would work. And I think initially it was developed to stop the war in Europe, but then again, it was used in the war in Asia.
And did it work?
Well, yeah, it worked quite well.
And so what was the consequence of that? The consequence was the next line, of course. The first and so far only use of nuclear weapons in a military context in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I think the figures on the screen there speak for themselves. 118,000 people were killed. So you're quite right. What you were getting at was that one of the main reasons for testing is a proof of concept. So it was indeed a proof that this could be usable. Tomorrow we're going to have a panel or a presentation on why states test. It's going to take place tomorrow morning. So that is one of the key reasons why states test, to prove that the technology works and that these weapons can actually be used. But it's certainly not the only reason why states test, and maybe we can get into that a little bit now. In 1949 was the first test by the Soviet Union, and this is really when the arms race got underway. It's interesting as well because it was also the first example of the detection of a nuclear test, 1949. The Soviet Union didn't announce the test. The US had built a test detection system that essentially relied on tracing radioactive fission products in a manner that's not that dissimilar from what the CTBTO currently does through radionuclide detection. But it was less sophisticated and without global scope. And it took about a month for the US to detect this, but nevertheless it was the first such example. I'll just go through this quickly. So we can see that other countries began to enter the fray. So we can see here another reason for testing, some of the political reasons for demonstrating might. A third reason for testing was the scaling up, as you can see, or the technical improvements that became possible over time. In 1961, we had the largest nuclear bomb test ever, 50 megatons. The preceding decade, we began to see an increasing awareness of the need to do something about nuclear testing. The link between nuclear testing and the arms race became quite apparent. So the first serious discussions or initiatives to put an end to nuclear testing got underway. One of the key ones here, with Nehru calling for a standstill agreement on nuclear testing in 1954. There was a peak in nuclear testing in 1962. And why does anyone think that was the case?
It was a Cuban missile crisis.
Oops. Yeah. Skip this one. If I can. It was indeed. So this diagram shows you some of the increases in scale of nuclear testing that came from the arms race over this particular time. And you can see here the Hiroshima bombs scale compared to the very largest that was, as we mentioned, in Ziaran. We will discuss tomorrow why states test, and we're also going to have a panel discussion tomorrow on the consequences of nuclear testing. So here's the peak that I mentioned, and you were quite right. This tallied with international events at the time, with the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is also an interesting slide. It shows the same figures essentially, but the line going across the middle demonstrates whether or not nuclear tests took place above ground or below ground.
So at almost the same point of time,
This is also an interesting slide. It shows the same figures essentially, but the line going across the middle demonstrates whether or not nuclear tests took place above ground. Partial nuclear test ban treaty. And what did the partial nuclear test ban treaty achieve?
It prohibited nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, but didn't prohibit it underground. So,
Why do you think it didn't prohibit it underground?
no. It's an interesting question, but
I guess that otherwise it won't be signed if it prohibited.
That's one view.
I think what got this motion started was that populations grew increasingly worried about the health consequences of testing in the atmosphere. And that's probably why they moved it underground.
I think that you're correct in what you say there. That's one correct answer. It's certainly the case that one of the drivers towards the partial test ban treaty was the growth in awareness of the environmental and health impacts of testing, particularly above ground. And in particular, there was quite a growth in civil society antagonism towards this kind of testing. Quite simply, nuclear testing that took place above ground was more visible. So removing it from the public eye also, to some extent, assuaged that part of civil society opinion that was worried about these health and environmental impacts. There is another reason, though, that one could imagine. And I would say that would be uncertainty about whether it was possible to verify a ban on nuclear testing below ground. And this is an issue that had, in a way, dogged the discussion on having a comprehensive nuclear test ban over the decades. It was really the development of sufficiently sophisticated verification tools that finally allowed countries to take the leap towards a properly comprehensive nuclear test ban. So these are some of the reasons. You may not be wrong as well about the political reason that you gave. So how many nuclear tests took place in the history of mankind? Development of sufficiently sophisticated verification tools that finally allowed countries to take the leap towards a properly comprehensive nuclear test ban. So these are some of the reasons. You may not be wrong as well about the political reason that you gave. And 2018. So the first one was in 1945, and when was the last one?
130.
Yeah, you're quite right. The last one took place in 2017 in North Korea. And it may well be the very last one. Interesting fact here, it's the equivalent to one explosion every 9 days for 50 years. And let us remember that each of these nuclear tests is an actual nuclear explosion with everything that entails. Now this is exactly what you were talking about. One of the drivers towards the partial test ban treaty were these environmental and health concerns. So in 1963, we achieved the partial test ban treaty, which aimed at protecting the environment and slowing the arms race. And, as you stated, bans testing in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater, but not underground. Not comprehensive. And on top of that, there was no verification regime even for those tests that were banned. Health concerns. So in 1963, we achieved the partial test ban treaty, which aimed at protecting the environment and slowing the arms race. And, as you stated, bans testing in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater, which will look at South Asia as well, to see if there are some interesting links that can be examined there between those countries. In 1968, the Non-Proliferation Treaty came about. The preamble of the NPT expresses a desire for a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty. And of course, Article 6 of that treaty requires practical measures to to be put in place, leading to a cessation of the nuclear arms race and disarmament. The NPT and the CTBT are two instruments that are very closely linked. And on Thursday, we're going to have a panel discussion on reinforcing the NPT through the CTBT. Can somebody tell me something about what the main provisions of the Non-Proliferation Treaty are? There are the three main pillars, I would say. Sorry. Oh.
Promote the civil use of nuclear technology.
Yes, any others?
Well, can I butt in?
Sure. Where are you?
Yes, I'm here. Actually, the NPT just enumerates the commitments undertaken by nuclear weapon states. That is Article 1, and Article 2 just enumerates the commitments of non-nuclear weapon states. And these are the key, like the commitments of nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. It's kind of a bargain between like haves and have-nots.
And that's something which is quite different from the CTBTO. CTBT has no haves and have-nots. It's a treaty that's equal for all states and doesn't discriminate between them. The Non-Proliferation Treaty does, as you say, create two classes of states. That is true. It allows certain countries to hold and maintain nuclear weapons. But there are trade-offs. Article 6 is the main trade-off that eventually they will agree to disarmament, the cessation of the nuclear arms race and disarmament. The other two pillars, the civil use of nuclear technologies, as you stated, the recognition of the right of states to the peaceful use of nuclear energy and technology. And the third pillar, if you like, being non-proliferation beyond those 5 states. So these 3 pillars are interrelated and they provide an interconnected system of duties and rights. We are right now in the middle of the review cycle of the NPT. The NPT is reviewed every 5 years. Initially, it was supposed to run out in 1995, in fact. It was a treaty of limited duration. But as part again of a bargain struck in advance of 1995, the treaty was indefinitely extended in that year. And one of the main reasons for its indefinite extension was the CTBT. It was an important element within that decision. At that particular time, the negotiations on the CTBT were going on. And as part of the package and conclusion of the NPT that year, in 1995, the finalization of the CTBT and its opening for signature was one of the key elements there. So you can see both, if you like, the roots of the CTBT in the preamble to the NPT, and you can see its indefinite extension as also providing impetus for the CTBT. The point of all of this is just to emphasize the fact that the global nuclear regime also contains the CTBT at its heart. That when we consider issues regarding the NPT, we should also keep in mind how nuclear testing has affected that and what role the CTBT has within that. So we've just covered some of those things now. So at review conferences, the entry into force of the CTBT is consistently called for. We just, as I said, are in the middle of the cycle, and we had a NPT PrepCom meeting last month, where again there were many statements made in favor of the CTBT's entry into force, and also many which drew important links between the CTBT and current issues on the Korean Peninsula. We're going to look a little bit now at how the CTBT itself came about. Who knows when the negotiations on the CTBT began?
1979 Conference on Disarmament.
I think.
1979 Conference on Disarmament.
Could you press the? Sorry, I didn't quite hear it. Yeah.
1979 Conference on Disarmament, if I'm not wrong.
Well, it was the Conference on Disarmament where the negotiations got underway, but it took a little bit longer. Okay. They started in the 90s, in fact, rather than then. But as you can see from this on screen, that doesn't mean that the international community wasn't thinking about the CTBT, because discussions had already got underway within this group of scientific experts that laid the groundwork for the CTBT verification regime. And it was really the work that began back then that made it that much easier to start the negotiating process on the political level in the 1990s. So 1993, this is when the CTBT negotiations began. And tomorrow morning, we're going to have a panel, which I mentioned earlier, I think, on examining the CTBT negotiations. And I think that it's something that I hope that you all draw some benefit from. We will have some people on the panel who were physically present and involved in the negotiations, and they could help maybe, they can help you to shed some light on why why the treaty has taken a certain form, why certain verification technologies were chosen, why certain provisions were written in a certain way, why we have this clause that requires certain countries to ratify before it enters into force. That's always a big question. And to kind of contextualize that for you and help you maybe understand a little bit better why the document is, why the instrument is what it is today. The CTBT opened for signature in 1996. The then US president was the first signatory to the treaty. Unfortunately, the United States hasn't ratified the treaty since then, but they were the first signatory to the treaty. I hope this is something that comes out in the panel discussion tomorrow, but I've had the benefit of talking to some people who were involved in the negotiation at the time, and I did ask them, did you really think it would take this long? Do you think it was going to take 20, 22 years plus to have the treaty into force? And I mean, without fail, at least those I've spoken to say no, they didn't think that it would cause such difficulty to have the 44 states complete the ratification procedures beyond a few years, which is very interesting. And we're going to talk a little bit in a few minutes again about that particular political challenge, which I guess most of you are aware of. The fact that we need certain countries to ratify the treaty before it enters into force. But before we get there, I want to tell you this strange story that we have of a treaty that may not be in force, but is in effect in operation. We have an organization called the CTBTO. The CTBTO, as it currently stands, does most of what the in-force organization would do, with some exceptions, of course. And we have a verification regime built around an international monitoring system that is almost complete. And in addition, is operating at a much higher level than was originally envisaged, even at the start, back in the 1990s. So what is the CTBT? We were comparing and contrasting with the NPT a little while ago, and we were talking about that treaty having different classes of countries, and that's not the case with this. It's a non-discriminatory treaty. It's an effective non-proliferation and disarmament measure, as we discussed in the NPT context a little bit. It's a very important step in building the trust and confidence needed to have a world without nuclear weapons. It's verifiable, and we're going to talk over the next few days in much more detail about the verification regime. And ultimately, this is it. It's an international treaty that bans all nuclear explosions by anyone, anywhere. This is a nice way of putting it, I think. The next session today will be on understanding the CTBT, and my colleague from legal services will be able to drill down a lot more into what specifically is in the treaty and what the provisions mean. 183 states have signed the treaty, 164 have ratified. Now, by any measure, this is a well adhered to arms control instrument. There are very few arms control instruments that have so many signatures and ratifiers. But we are in the unusual situation of, despite having 164 states that ratified, not having the treaty into force. So it still needs action. As I mentioned, the CTBTO itself is more or less up and running. Our executive secretary is Dr. Lucina Zerbo. He will address the sessions later in the week, particularly during the high-level session on Friday. Dr. Zerbo is a geologist. He has a scientific background, and before he took over as Executive Secretary, he was Director of the International Data Center Division here. So he was the first leader of the organization to actually come specifically from a scientific background. He often says himself he used to be a scientist and then he became a diplomat. I don't know, I think he's the epitome of science diplomacy himself. He is an ability to do both at the same time, which I think is very admirable. And one of the tasks that he has, of course, is articulating support for the treaty and trying to grow the networks we need to convince states to join. And that's why he's not here today, because he's in Brussels at a series of meetings organized by Belgium, which is an incoming co-chair of the Article 14 process for entry into force, for those of you who are aware of that, and the European Union, in order to galvanize support for the treaty. In terms of staff, we have over 300 right now, based here in the Vienna International Center, and staff from over 70 countries. Our headquarters is here. We have a number of facilities located right here. The International Data Center is the hub of the verification system. And we also have a few test stations that can be viewed. So all of you will have the opportunity to view these next Monday. If you haven't done so, please make sure to sign up for those visits. I think it's very worthwhile. And the organization is divided, if you like, into 5 different divisions. I'm from the Legal and External Relations one. We have 3, I would say, technical divisions: the International Monitoring System Division, the International Data Center Division, and the Onsite Inspection Division. And of course, the Administration Division as well. On-site inspections is something I haven't touched on yet. We're going to spend half of next week dealing with on-site inspections. Very interesting area, but the only part of the verification toolkit that we cannot yet use, unfortunately. Entry into force is needed before the international community can make use of CTBT on-site inspections. Other elements we're already able to share, and we do share. Our IMS is constantly monitoring and detecting for signs of nuclear explosions, and this data, both in raw and reviewed form, is shared with our state signatories. But the actual holding of an on-site inspection, in the case of suspicion of a possible nuclear test explosion, can only take place once we have an executive council following entry into force that takes a decision to mount such an inspection. And next week, you guys are going to be the executive council, and you will decide on the basis of evidence whether or not there should be an on-site inspection in a given case. By then, you will be so familiar with the treaty and the procedures that I'm sure it's going to be like second nature to you. In the packages that you got on registration earlier, you will find a copy of the treaty, and you will find a copy of the rules of procedure of the PrepCom. Please hold on to those. You're going to need them for the simulation next week. The treaty, obviously, to drill down into those provisions on on-site inspections, and the rules of procedure we will use as rules of procedure for the Executive Council next week. So please do hold on to those. More material will also follow, of course. A few words about the verification regime. The verification regime is based on 4 technologies in the international monitoring system. So let's see, who knows what the 4 technologies are? At this side of the room, there must be somebody.
Infrasound, seismic, hydroacoustic, and radionuclide.
Absolutely correct. Can you share with me what your background is, if you don't mind?
In acoustics.
Okay. So, and how in terms of your professional engagement with the CTBT, have you, you're familiar with the CTBT, you're working on the technical side of CTBT?
No, I just finished my PhD degree.
Excellent, excellent. And your knowledge of these 4 technologies, or the fact that we use those 4 technologies, did this come about through your preparation for attendance here, or is it something that you were already aware of?
Sorry, I wasn't
Were you already aware of these 4 technologies before you decided to attend the...
Yes,
you were?
yes.
Okay, that's excellent. That's excellent. Yeah, as you state, the IMS is based on these 4 different technologies that you stated, and you're going to meet the real experts in that in the next few days. There's not really much I can say about them without... But there are 337 facilities throughout the world: seismic, hydroacoustic, infrasound, and radionuclide. And they're connected together to our international data center located right here. 170 seismic stations worldwide, 11 hydroacoustic stations, 60 infrasound stations, and 80 radionuclide facilities as well. So, as I said, there are going to be a number of different sessions that look into different elements of this, including how we maintain the network of stations and facilities, which is really a big issue now that the system is quite mature, coming up to 20 years or 20 years plus of having the system in place. As you can imagine, over time, the maintenance of such a system becomes more and more important, particularly when you consider that so many of these stations and other facilities are located in very, very isolated spots worldwide. I think that this is a little bit straightforward, but you get an idea of how data flows. So here we have an infrasound array, which is being transmitted by satellite. Here we have I think it's a radionuclide, yeah, example. But there will be a lot more detail on that, so please hold off any detailed questions you have about that and spare my blushes and direct them at my technical colleagues when they take over the sessions in due course. On-site inspections, I already mentioned this a little bit, only possible after entry into force of the treaty. We have an entire day devoted to OSI next Wednesday. I'm very excited to see what my colleagues in the OSI division have planned for that day, because they've been keeping it to themselves a little bit. I know that they are by their nature, there are people who are very heavily involved in training inspectors and in preparing simulation type exercises, because a lot of course, of what we can do for OSI right now is to prepare for entry into force. As soon as we get closer to entry into force, we're obliged to make sure that the verification system is up and running. So the OSI component is as important as any other. My colleagues, therefore, I'm sure are going to have a very exciting day for you on Wednesday and get you very much involved in what they're doing, so it won't just be somebody talking at you like I am doing. And then, as I mentioned, on Thursday and Friday, we're going to have our Executive Council simulation. And my colleague Nikita said a few words about it earlier. I think that there's going to be something in this for everybody, regardless of what your background is. Whether you're a younger person, a student who has done Model UN type work, or whether you're a seasoned diplomat, I think there's going to be a lot that you can learn from that process. And I hope that you'll enjoy it as well. Yeah, and this, of course, is another important element of the verification regime. It's the consultation and clarification and confidence-building measures as well. Just wanted to say a few words about the kind of capacity building and training that we carry out, particularly for developing countries. We have frequent technical courses, workshop and training courses, and we really do work to try to enable all states to make the most use possible out of the verification regime. This goes, again, I think a little back into the issue of equality between states where the CTBT is concerned. We do work with all states to try to ensure that their own national institutions are built up in a way that they can make the best use of CTBT data. We are going to have a presentation on Wednesday, I think, on civil and scientific applications of the CTBT verification regime. This is really an exciting sort of spin-off area of the CTBT system that was certainly not planned for during the negotiations of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. But over time, it became apparent that there were certain uses of CTBT data that go beyond nuclear test monitoring and detection, but are still of benefit to the global community. And that includes such issues as tsunami warning, climate change research. In fact, we find new applications all the time. Just a few months ago, and I think that this was mentioned in one of the presentations earlier, CTBT hydroacoustic data was of use to the authorities in Argentina as they searched for their stricken submarine a number of months ago, the ARA San Juan. And we really encourage the scientific community to make the best use of this data and to try to find new and interesting applications. It's one of the reasons why every 2 years we have the Science and Technology Conference. And I know that some of you were at the SNT, I think I heard you mentioning that. The Science and Technology Conference is a rather big event that we do, usually at the Hofburg Palace in the center of Vienna. For those of you who are new to Vienna, I hope you have some time to enjoy the city center and the lovely old architecture there. But the Hofburg Palace is a really grand building which also serves as a conference center. Every 2 years we hold a Science and Technology Conference which has a number of aims, but one of them is really to bring together scientists to look at different uses of CTBT data and to really encourage outside-the-box thinking in terms of verification technologies, but also in terms of other uses of CTBT technologies as they currently stand. And it's always very interesting to see some of the presentations, to look at some of the papers there, and to find out what new and exciting elements are being developed. We've in fact put in place a system where CTBT data can be shared with academic institutions through what we call the Virtual Data Exploitation Center, VDEC. And myself and my colleagues would be happy to talk to any of you who might fall into that category during the course of the next 2 weeks if it's something that you're interested in pursuing. Okay, so I suppose this is the real sort of nub here. Political challenges, entry into force. Okay, I'll go back to this one. So you can see from this map which states have signed the treaty, which have ratified, and which states are non-signatory states. So it's kind of good news, right? I mean, when you look at that, you see the states that are colored orange are rather few. That's the good news. And if you consider that both white and green states have at least signed the treaty, I think this helps you understand that really it is the vast majority of the world. As things currently stand, the CTBTO, before entry into force, the Preparatory Commission for the CTBTO, all signatory states are full members of the Preparatory Commission. So states such as China, such as the United States and others, Egypt, Iran, they take an active and equal part in the organization as it currently stands. They contribute to it financially, some of them very generously. They have staff members working here. They support it in technical ways as well. But for various reasons, some of those have not yet completed their ratification procedures. The famous Annex 2 to the treaty lists 44 countries whose ratifications must be complete before it enters into force. I have to tell you that this is a rather unusual provision. It wasn't the kind of provision that I was very used to before I first connected with the CTBT myself. It's not unusual to require a certain number of countries to ratify a treaty before it enters into force. In fact, it makes good sense to do that. But at least I'm not really aware of another treaty that lists specific countries that must themselves ratify before it becomes valid for all countries. So who knows why these 44 specific countries were listed?
Well, these are the so-called nuclear technology countries to begin with, and all those countries took an active part in the CD Conference on Disarmament. So that's why they decided to just incorporate this provision in Annex 2 to the treaty.
Can I ask you, how many people have completed the modules, the online modules? Well, a few have. Good, good, good. Yeah, this is one of those questions I think that appears there, so now you know the answer to that. Indeed. But if we go further, what was the rationale for coming up with this list, would you say? What was the point of requiring these states?
Maybe it has to do with the possibility to commit states that have the technology or have nuclear weapons, I think. It's like...
Essentially, yes. I mean, the list is a very broad one. It contained countries that certainly were not in any imaginable way on the path to developing. Austria was listed. But there had been some discussion, as I understand it, and you know, those who actually took part in the negotiations can correct me on this tomorrow during the session if they wish to. There had been discussion about A, whether or not to have some means of ensuring that certain countries were brought into the treaty, and B, about how to actually do this in a way that was understandable and in a way that you know, would work without maybe pointing the finger too much at specific countries. In the end, this was the formula that was decided on. The inclusion on 2 lists created by the IAEA of countries with certain nuclear technologies and facilities who were also members of the CD at that particular time. So that's how we came up with this list of 44 countries. Since then, 8 of the 44 states are still to ratify the treaty. So that means, on the good side of things, that 36 have ratified, 36 of those countries. So which 8 are remaining? Press the microphone button.
United States, China.
Yeah, do we have any more?
India, Pakistan, Israel.
Yeah, Egypt.
North Korea.
Yeah. Yeah. Is that it? Yeah. China, yes. So, how do we get over this problem? What do you suggest as a strategy to have these countries ratify the treaty? Could you press the microphone?
If North Korea joined the CTBT, I think we can encourage the other countries to join the CTBT.
Maybe the US. I think if US will ratify, the other countries will follow. Israel.
You know what I think is really interesting? That the first country that somebody pointed to was North Korea. If I had done this talk last year, nobody would have even suggested that. It would have been completely unimaginable to even suggest that North Korea might at some point move towards denuclearization, whatever that means, and possibly joining the CTBT. So what do we learn from that? We learn that strange things can happen. We learn that you need to take opportunities when they come. We learn, I think, that we can't always stay inside the certainties that we imagine exist. A few years ago, when I first joined the CTBT, it was almost a given that politically the United States would move in a different direction than it has moved. And it was almost a given that there would be a concerted effort by the administration there to move forward with ratification. Right now, I don't think we're quite imagining that that's going to happen. But I think as well during the course of the discussions in the next 2 weeks, we should be aware that we can't remain glued to these kind of certainties or uncertainties. And as for North Korea, yeah, that's something that we really couldn't have imagined a few years ago. When we did this kind of presentation, and the key domino was always the United States. because everyone imagined that the United States was the game changer. And maybe it's still true. I mean, the United States was one of the prime movers in the CTBT negotiations. It is, undoubtedly, historically, the country that has conducted the most nuclear tests. It is, along with China, one of the two remaining P5 countries, nuclear weapons states in the NPT context, who would need to ratify it. So all of that is true. But there was a presumption that if the political stars could align in some way in the United States and the ratification could take place, then we could very quickly see a ratification following by China, and that it could unlock some of the issues in the Middle East to some extent. And that we would get to a phase where, bit by bit, some of those outlier countries would feel so exposed that maybe they themselves would find that they would possibly take the leap to sign and ratify the treaty. And now, funnily, we're talking about North Korea, and I'd ask you to remember that quote by the representative at the Conference on Disarmament that I opened the talk with today, where he talked about the possibility of joining international efforts. That doesn't actually state signing and ratifying the CTBT. Maybe it means something else. But still, the fact that something like that can be said by a representative of the DPRK this year, when this is the country, the only country to have conducted nuclear tests this century, a country that conducted 2 nuclear tests last year, I mean, it's an interesting fact. It's an interesting thing. During some of the panel discussions later this week, we're going to be able to look very specifically at some of those issues. We'll have one on the DPRK, and we already had a little foreshadow of that issue, I think, this morning with the excellent CTBTO youth group presentations. So it's going to be interesting, really, to see what the experts present here and everybody in the room thinks about possibilities where DPRK is concerned. But we can, of course, also talk about all of the other remaining states and what the push and pull factors are or might be to encourage ratifications in regions and among specific countries. Yeah. So here is the list of countries. I think we got them all right. And efforts to boost entry into force. Again, this is linking with some of the discussion this morning on spreading the news and on what Sahil and the others were talking about in terms of building force multipliers, if you like, for the CTBT. The CTBTO youth group has been one of the most interesting, I think, advocacy developments in the last 2 years, and it's been so special to see it grow from a group that had some kind of tangential link to what we do into, I would say, really a bunch of experts on CTBT that leaves some of us in shame on with the amount of knowledge and expertise that they've developed over the last couple of years. But their work links with the kind of work that we as a secretariat can do in terms of education, for example. This symposium is part of an ongoing education program that we have run in the CTBTO for many years. We had a number of science and diplomacy courses, which we upgraded 2 years ago into a symposium. And going forward, which we want to, I think, build more strongly into the science and technology process that we do with the major conferences in the Hofburg, so that there is a seamless link between the main education and convening activities that we do, I suppose, in the CTBTO. The Article 14 process I mentioned briefly earlier when I spoke about the Belgian foreign minister, who's the current incoming co-chair of the Article 14 conference, along with the foreign minister of Iraq. This is a system that is provided for under the treaty, whereby every 2 years a conference takes place to encourage entry into force. It's one of the methods we use to bring together supporters of the treaty at the highest political level, so generally at foreign minister level. And it takes place either in Vienna or in New York. In years where we don't have an Article 14 conference, we have a ministerial meeting, which is not run by the Secretariat itself, but it's run by friends of the CTBT in conjunction with us in support. And this year there should be such a ministerial meeting later this year, again in New York. The group of eminent persons, if you like, is kind of an analog to the CTBTO youth group. Well, maybe it should be the other way around because the group of eminent persons came first. But this is a very diverse group of people with expertise in different international and scientific, on different international and scientific issues. Some of whom have always had, I think, a very close relationship with the CTBT, and others who developed it more over the years. And this is really a group of people who can reach parts that we as a secretariat can't reach. They're able to open doors. They're able to engage with countries that haven't yet signed or ratified the treaty. They're able to articulate the reasons for signing and ratifying the treaty in a way that nobody else can. And they've become great mentors of the CTBTO youth group in many ways. And we're very lucky that this week we're going to have a number of members of the group of eminent persons taking part in various sessions. Yeah, so maybe this is almost out of time, but I just want to leave you with a few thoughts on recent developments in disarmament and non-proliferation and how we can try to find some opportunities for the CTBT in that context. I think we've spoken about the DPRK quite a bit already, so that's certainly one of those issues. All I can say about that is I don't know either, because we're going to have to see what happens this week and next week. It seems like every day there's another story and you don't really know whether it's going in this way or that way. But if things go according to plan, we could expect maybe to see the dismantlement in full of the test site in the coming days, and preparations may well continue for the summit between the United States and North Korea. So what that will mean for the CTBT is something I think that we can also consider over the course of the next 2 weeks. A few other issues to maybe look into in your own time and to consider how they connect with the CTBT. We mentioned the NPT review process. I'd like to draw your attention to the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2310, which was adopted by the Security Council 2 years ago, and which is specifically on the CTBT, which calls for its ratification by remaining countries, and which states that the international community should make use of the verification regime even before entry into force. A very interesting resolution, the first specifically on the CTBT and the CTBTO. Then there's the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which nobody has mentioned yet, but I'm sure that some of you in the room at least are quite aware of. This is a treaty that has been negotiated and which is currently open for signature, and which purports to entirely ban nuclear weapons, including their possession and their use and, in fact, their testing, but doesn't actually put in place any kind of verification system for that. What that means for the CTBT, what the relationship with this treaty, which also is not in force yet, is something that some of you may wish to consider in the next few days. Where did I put this? There's that domino slide, I did include it. So as I said, we used to think that a domino would fall and then the others would all collapse as well. I'm not sure that we can really see it quite like that anymore. But who knows? Whether it's the DPRK that goes first, whether it's surprisingly the United States, whether it's China. A lot of people talk about Chinese leadership in the world, and maybe this is one way that China can also show its leadership in this very important area. It remains to be seen whether others would then follow. So what happens next is one of those issues I think that we're going to consider here in the next couple of weeks, where we're going to move forward with the entry into force of the CTBT. That brings me, I think, to the end of this introductory CTBT 101 course. There is plenty more information, for example, on our website about the history of the CTBT, of nuclear testing, of the group of scientific experts, and I would encourage you really to have a look at that. I think you might find it of benefit over the course of the next couple of weeks. Before we move into the next session, can I just ask if anyone has any questions at this point? Pierce Corden.
Yes, thank you. Pierce Corden, who at one point was the admin director here. But for better or for worse, I started working on CTBT in 1971 when I joined the U.S. Arms Control Agency. And that was fairly close to the time when the Limited Test Ban Treaty had been negotiated. To go back to that point in the presentation about why the LTBT and why not a CTBT verification was clearly an important issue, but the US and the USSR and the UK had gotten to a point where they weren't that far apart on the number of on-site inspections and remote instrumentation installations. The Soviet Union said 3 and the US said 7. You could imagine that there might have been a compromise there. My sense was, and I think it has remained part of the whole business until today, that the individuals, parts of governments that focus heavily on the weapons end of things, their influence in situations like this can be brought to bear quietly, if you will, to make things not happen. And I don't know that we'll ever know what the reality was then, but it's important to recognize that prior to the negotiation of the LTBT, which took a few weeks in the summer of 1963, there were several years of serious negotiations on a CTBT, and there was another attempt at serious negotiations in 1963 to 76 to 79, prior to the actual negotiations that began in 1993. So it's a process that has very deep roots and very strong connections to the military side, which is understandable since the objective of it is to do something about weapons. So just to provide a little bit more perspective on why did the LTBT happen and why didn't a CTBT happen at that time.
Thank you very much for that perspective. And for those of you who are wondering about the nomenclature, PTBT and LTBT, that's the same thing. Any other questions or comments? Please. Before you ask your question, could you please indicate your name and designation?
I'm Louis. My designation is student, if that counts. I feel especially foolish asking this question after this eminent gentleman, but since it's the 101 session, I just want to ask, why is it not possible, technically, to change this provision about the Annex 2 states requirement and have the treaty enter into force without them, especially if the Resolution 2310 called for using the verification system before the entry into force?
Louis, that's a really interesting question, and it's one that has been asked many times. I think as years have gone on since the treaty was open for signature, a number of scholars, both on the political science side and on the international law side, have thought about how this obstacle can be overcome, and there are a range of different suggestions for how this might take place. One of the benefits of doing the CTBT 101 session is that I can defer all of the responses to people who are going to cover more specific elements. The next session is actually the legal session. So it's going to be run by Xiaodong Yang, who's the the chief of our legal services section. And this question is right up his alley. So I'm going to have to defer to him on that. But it's a subject that also interests me and that I've read about and thought about as well. But I would encourage you to put that same question to him, and he may even offer it as part of his presentation. Any other comments? Great. So we are going to have a break now until... What time is it now? We're going to break until 4, if I'm not mistaken. And then we will resume with the session led by Legal Services section. Can I just ask one thing, which is if the following persons wouldn't mind coming up to the podium if you're present in the room. From the Solomon Islands, Miss Miriam Lidimani, representatives from Tuvalu, if present, Mr. Samuelu Taratake and Miss Savali Fatoga, representative from Tonga, Miss Darlene Vea, representatives from Timor-Leste, Mr. Tadeo Marcelino Suarez and Ms. Estefania Luis Simon da Costa, and finally representative from Papua New Guinea, Mr. John V. Wemin. If any of those persons are present, would you mind coming up to me right now? So for the rest of you, please enjoy the break. We have Mr. Xiaodong Yang, who's Chief of Legal Services here at CTBTO, who's going to speak to the symposium on the topic of understanding the CTBT, scope, obligations, and compliance. Xiaodong, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cormac, for the introduction. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this presentation. Sorry. Okay, I've been given my most favorite topic to talk about today, namely understanding the CTBT, scope, obligations, and compliance. First of all, may I ask if each of you has got a copy of this little booklet? If not, please make sure that you ask my colleagues for one afterwards. This will prove extremely important later on in the course of the symposium and also at the last stage of the symposium when we shall have a simulation of the future Executive Council. I'd like to start by providing you with a brief account of the context of the CTBT. In this respect, I'd like to mention 3 documents as in forming a closely interconnected group, namely the 1963 Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, PTBT, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, and our treaty, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And please kindly note one historical moment which took place back in the year 1995, when time came for the fate of the NPT to be decided by the very terms of that treaty, that is 25 years after the entry into force of the NPT. Upon the NPT Review and Extension Conference, it was decided that the NPT shall continue in force indefinitely. That is actually the formula used in the treaty itself. And then the second decision was that the states should work on the completion of the negotiations on a universal and internationally and effectively verifiable comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty no later than 1996. That is one of the reasons why the CTBT was adopted towards the end of the year 1996 at the UN General Assembly. Now, the first treaty which I'll examine is the treaty banning nuclear weapon tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater, which is also referred to as the Partial Test Ban Treaty, the PTBT. I shall not bore you with a detailed reading of the provisions that I'm quoting here. Excuse me. I'm merely calling your attention to the underlined words, and you will see that these words will recur in the other two treaties. That is, in the preamble of the CTBT, there was a reference to general and complete disarmament under strict international control, and also the discontinuance of all test explosions of nuclear weapons for all time. And then Article 1 of that treaty lays down the basic obligations of the states parties. You don't have to read the whole of the article. All you need is simply trying to bear in mind for a short while these words: prohibit, prevent, not to carry out, and then to refrain from. Namely, to prohibit and to prevent nuclear weapon tests, and to refrain from causing or encouraging or in any way participating in such tests. Now, this is one of my favorite slides. I'm sure it has already been shown to you by my other colleagues. This is what happened right after the 1963 PTBT entered into force. You can see all the nuclear tests went underground. If you may recall, the title of that treaty is a treaty banning nuclear weapon tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. That leaves the underground as the only permissible environment to conduct nuclear tests. So that is why almost all the nuclear tests that took place after 1963 went underground. I'm showing this slide to make a point, that is how powerful a legally binding norm can shape reality on the ground. This is what the 1963 PTBT did. It pushed all the nuclear weapon tests underground. And if you move a little bit onwards, when time comes to 1996 and after that, which was the year of the adoption of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which also bans, apart from, on top of those three environments, which also bans nuclear tests underground, there was next to no nuclear tests after that time. That is why we stress the point again on many occasions and in many fora that it is nothing can be the substitute for a legally binding norm against nuclear tests. Okay, we move on to the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT. Again, I'm drawing your attention to the underlined words. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound discontinuance of all test explosions of nuclear weapons for all time? For your benefit, let's come back to the PTBT in the preamble. Discontinuance of all test explosions of nuclear weapons for all time. And then Article 6 of the NPT refers to a general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. Again, we come back to the PTBT, the preamble of which refers to general and complete disarmament under strict international control. Now we come to our treaty, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Its preamble refers to the ultimate goal of achieving and then it contains a reference to, remember decision number 2 of the NPT extension with regards to the indefinite extension of the NPT, the universal and internationally and effectively verifiable Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And then it refers to discontinuance again of all test explosions of nuclear weapons for all time. Now, I'm showing this not to show you how repetitive these international treaties can be. I'm trying to demonstrate the position of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in the grand scheme of things. It is all connected. It is an important document in the international regime for international disarmament. That is how it is connected to all these other very effective international systems under the PTBT and the NPT. So it is not just one isolated document waiting there to be recognized by people. It is one important pillar of the international effort to achieve nuclear disarmament. Now, the basic obligations under the CTBT, again, please pay attention just to the underlined words. Not to carry out, prohibit and prevent, and refrain from. Again, the exact words in Article 1 of the PTBT. Prohibit, prevent, not to carry out, refrain from. So, apart from the difference in the number of environments disallowed for nuclear tests, in that the CTBT provides for a complete and comprehensive ban on nuclear tests. The basic obligations under the PTBT and the CTBT are actually exactly the same. Now, you may want to ask the question, now, so what's the difference then? Let's forget about this underground and non-underground thing. Then what's the difference between the PTBT and the CTBT? Now, I'm going to do a very brief comparative analysis of the PTBT and the CTBT, and we can do it together in less than 1 minute. No prior knowledge. Double-sided. This is 1 page, and this is 1 page. Altogether, 2 pages. This is the Partial Test Ban Treaty, the PTBT. Now, there's a reason why I asked you if you've got a booklet of the CTBT. Now, you all have this in your hand. Can you please check how many pages the CTBT has? 121 pages. That's the difference. You don't have to know any other difference. That is both the legal and factual difference between the CTBT and the PTBT. That shows the scope, the massive scope of the CTBT as compared with the PTBT. Now, what happened? Now, when you have a difference of that magnitude, something must be terribly wrong, or something must be terribly right. In our case, it is something terribly right, because the CTBT provides for 2 things that the PTBT doesn't have. Namely, it provides for an international verification regime to verify compliance with the treaty, and secondly, it provides for a treaty organization to implement that verification regime. And that makes all the difference. And that is what we are talking about today, namely scope, obligations, and compliance. That is the scope of the treaty. We'll return to the So, in order to appreciate the comprehensiveness of the scope of the comprehensive, that's why it is called Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, we may want to pay attention to these 3 areas concerning the treaty. That is the basic obligations, including the ban on underground tests, of course, and the treaty organization and the verification regime. the treaty organization. Once the treaty enters into force, the treaty will have its own treaty organization, which shall consist of a conference of the states parties, which will be the principal organ of the organization, and an executive council, which will be the executive organ of the organization, and a technical secretariat, of which the International Data Center forms part. The Conference of the States Parties will have the power and function to decide, to discuss all matters under the treaty, whereas the Executive Council shall have the power to decide on, among other things, on-site inspections. And I'm sure we'll return to the subject of on-site inspections later on during the course of the symposium and at the last stage of the symposium, where we all play our role in the simulated Executive Council, which is going to be fun. I can show you. I see some of my friends here smiling. It's going to be absolute fun, I can assure you. So please come at the end of this, during the last 2 days of the symposium, or follow it online. So then Technical Secretariat takes care of handling of data and also the operations of the international monitoring system. Now that is the treaty organization. Next comes the verification regime. Now we all know Article 4 there that makes provisions for the verification regime. Under Article 4, the verification regime shall consist of 4 components: an international monitoring system, consultations and clarification, on-site inspections, and confidence-building measures. I'm referred here, emphasizing especially the international monitoring system and the on-site inspections. Now the next part of that provision is actually, at this stage, the single most important provision for this treaty and for this preparatory commission for the treaty. That is, at entry into force of this treaty, the verification regime shall be capable of meeting the verification requirements of the treaty. Now it sounds simple and innocuous, but then my point here today is to show you the massive scale of work this simple provision here involves. At the entry into force of this treaty, the verification regime shall be capable of meeting the verification requirements of the treaty. Now, what does this mean? For the verification regime to be capable of meeting the verification requirements, there has to be a verification regime first. Do you agree? There has to be a verification regime first before that regime can be capable. Now, again, the verification regime consists of, among other things, the international monitoring system and on-site inspections activities. Now, what is the international monitoring system? The international monitoring system shall consist of 337 facilities located all over the globe. Now, some of these facilities already existed at the time when the treaty was adopted, but a lot more others would have to be constructed from scratch. Over 300 stations and other facilities. That is the scale of work that is needed for the treaty to be effectively implemented. And that is what the current Commission has been doing for the past 20 years. And I'm proud to say that at the moment, at the time that as we speak, 90% of that system has already been completed. And now, pending the completion of the remaining 10% of that system, it is no longer possible, as far as technology is concerned, for anybody, anywhere, to conduct a nuclear test. It is no longer possible, I repeat, technically, for anybody, anywhere, to conduct a nuclear test without this organization knowing it. So that is the scale of work needed for the implementation of the treaty. This is, again, one of my favorite slides. This shows the locations of all the over 300 IMS facilities on the globe. This is what the IMS should look like, both as a matter of law and as a matter of fact. As a matter of law, now if you happen to have this booklet with you, if you please turn to any random page between 90 and 120 and 110. So you can see beside any station there are coordinates, latitude and longitude. That means each station will have to be located exactly at the spot as fixed by the treaty. So all these spots are actually fixed by the CTBT. That is why I'm saying this is what the IMS looks like as a matter of law, because all these locations are fixed by the treaty. Of course, there are slight modifications in actual practice when it comes to the construction of a particular station, but largely this is how the international monitoring system looks as a matter of law, and once it is completed in strict accordance with the treaty, it is how the international monitoring system looks as a matter of fact. More than that, I'm using this slide to show you the global reach of the future treaty organization and of the current Preparatory Commission, because all these stations are at the moment operated under the authority of the Preparatory Commission. So that is the IMS. Now, the scale of the on-site inspection component of the international monitoring system. Back in the year 2014, many of my friends here would know that, the Preparatory Commission conducted the largest ever field exercise in Jordan. Now, it took 4 years for preparation. It was 5 weeks in the conduct. It involved 150 tons of specialized equipment, over 200 international experts. So this would be the scale. This was only the scale of just one mere field exercise, testing 15 out of 17 of the OSI techniques. Imagine what a full-scale, real on-site inspection would be in its scope and in the resources. The scale of work for this Preparatory Commission to develop such kind of capabilities, including equipment and expertise and training of personnel. So much for the scope and the obligations under the treaty. Right? My last point, I'm hoping that I can finish by 30 half past so that we can have the rest of the time for questions. As for the issue of compliance, we can approach it from these three aspects. First one, national implementation measures. Second one, again, the verification regime. And the third one, the decision-making processes. Now, Article 3 of the treaty provides for national implementation measures. These are the measures taken, that's why they're called national implementation measures. They are measures taken at national level to implement these international obligations. So under Article 3, states parties are required by the treaty to put in measures, including legislation, to prevent, of course, to prohibit nuclear tests, and they are also required to engage in international cooperation, both with the treaty organization and with other states parties. And they also required, each of them, to establish a national authority so as to act as a liaison, between the organization and the other states parties. There are other measures that would be involved. That is, each state party, upon entering into force of the treaty, should recognize the future treaty organization as an international organization with all the privileges and immunities, international status, legal capacity granted to that organization. And each state, under Article 4 of the treaty, is required to permit on-site inspections in its own territory and to assist and facilitate in the conduct of such on-site inspections. And then, of course, under the treaty, it is not for the treaty organization to decide on its own initiative to conduct an on-site inspection. As an on-site inspection always has to be requested by a state party before the organization can decide. So the decision of the organization to go ahead with an on-site inspection is always a decision on a request for an on-site inspection. It is not actually an initiative on the part of the treaty organization to decide, let's go for an on-site inspection. It's always a request. So each of the states parties in the future to the treaty shall have the right to request an on-site inspection. Well, that is easier said than done because each state shall have an equal right to request an on-site inspection, then technically each state shall have an equal need to be able to understand the data provided to them by the international monitoring system. Supposing you don't have any expert at all in your country who would be able to tell you, as far as I can see, on the basis of the data and information we receive from the international monitoring system, there might be some suspicious event. Supposing you have no expert to tell you this, then it is just empty words to say you have a right to request an on-site inspection because you would have no clue whether or not you should indeed request an on-site inspection. And more than that, under the treaty, the states parties are actually prohibited from making an abusive or frivolous request. So if you cannot be sure about the data, how can you be sure that your request for an on-site inspection is not unfounded, frivolous, or abusive? Once a decision is taken by the organization that your request for an on-site inspection is frivolous or abusive, the country will face consequences like loss of right to request an on-site inspection in a period of time, for example. So, measures related to capacity building would also be important to ensure, again, compliance with the treaty and to ensure that each state party shall have a meaningful enjoyment of the right to request an on-site inspection. Okay, we've done that already. So, the issue of compliance applies to all these areas. So far as the international monitoring system is concerned, the organization, both the organization and the states parties must comply with the treaty with regard to the construction of the monitoring facilities, to the management of such facilities, and to the handling of data and to the use of such data for matters of verification. And then, as another component of the international monetary system, OSI is concerned, again, compliance with the treaty is required in these fields: development of capabilities, including equipment and techniques, and training of personnel, designation and training of inspectors, standing arrangements, decision-making, and conduct of inspections, and then what to do with the results of an inspection. And the Executive Council will have an elaborate deliberation and consideration on the on-site inspection report, and the states parties will have to act accordingly. Now, this is why the CTBT is such a massive document. All these points are covered in a most minute, elaborate, detailed way by the treaty, down to how many hours are required for the Executive Council to take a decision on an on-site inspection request, and how many hours the inspection team must start its work upon arrival in the territory of the inspected state party, for example. Now, all these are meant to ensure that the international verification regime, as provided for under the treaty, will operate smoothly and effectively and ensure meaningful results, so that the international community by then could be certain that no unpermissible nuclear weapon explosion test could be carried out without all the consequences stipulated in the treaty. Lastly, decision-making processes. These decisions fall into three categories: decisions regarding the treaty organization as contained in Article 2, decisions regarding the verification regime as contained in Article 4, and decisions in cases of non-compliance, especially in the wake of an on-site inspection operation on the basis of a decision or decisions taken by the Executive Council, contained in Article 5. Thank you very much for your attention, and I think we would still have about 12 or so minutes for questions. Any questions, please? Yes, please.
I'm Arif Surahman from Indonesia. I have a question. First, what is the output of the decision come from on-site inspection? And second, what is the instrument to push everybody to implement the CTBT? Thank you.
Okay, first question. The output or following an on-site inspection would be two. Generally speaking, just not exactly that number. First of all, there will be a report by the inspection team called on-site inspection report. Secondly, there will be a series of decisions taken by the Executive Council on the question whether there was indeed a non-compliance of the treaty. And the Executive Council shall recommend measures to the Conference of the States Parties to be taken to address any issue of non-compliance. So, inspection report and decisions taken by the Executive Council. Second, the instruments for implementing the CTBT. Again, we would have two broad categories: national instruments and international instruments. National instruments are national legislation, administrative decisions, or maybe in some cases you would have court decisions as well for the implementation of the treaty. International instruments would be agreements derived from the CTBT, arrangements, host agreements, standing arrangements concerning the state of the inspectors, for example, the granting of immunities and privileges to the organization and to the inspection team, and also decisions, resolutions adopted by the treaty organization, because by that time all the states parties shall be members of the treaty organization, and they will be equally bound by the decisions and resolutions of the treaty organization. So, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Wang, for a very wonderful presentation. I am Mr. Joel Obengo from Kenya. Drawing from the experience, the lessons learned from JCPOA, where the United States has challenged the reports of IAEA as regarding the compliance of Iran to the JCPOA, don't you foresee a situation where maybe a country can challenge an inspection report, just as the US has challenged the report of IAEA?
Okay, thank you for the question. Okay, I shall not comment on the Iran nuclear deal itself, because it is not documented under the CTBT, of course. As for the compliance of the state signatories with the CTBT, again, I'm referring you to Article 5 of the CTBT, under which you can see there will be measures taken by the future treaty organization, and the treaty organization is also authorized by the CTBT to refer the matter to the attention of the United Nations. Now, you need to be very, very careful about that reference there. It is to refer to the attention of the United Nations. It doesn't specify whether that should be the General Assembly or the Security Council. So the United Nations would cover all the major organs of the United Nations. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Max Höll from Germany. I'd like to know what criteria were used to decide the precise locations of the IMS stations. And second, are the IMS stations in non-ratifying Annex II states up and running? Thank you.
Okay, the criteria for deciding on the locations of the IMS stations were made scientifically by a large group of scientists in preparation, actually, for the treaty. They were not made by the lawyers. They were totally scientifically fixed. As for the, though there's no distinction, actually, so far as the hosting countries are concerned, between the Annex II states and non-Annex II states. That distinction is only significant as far as the entry into force of the treaty is concerned. So as far as the construction and operation of the IMS are concerned, so that distinction does not actually apply. Thank you. Okay, please.
Thanks for your comprehensive presentation. My name is Hương Nguyễn from Vietnam. Actually, I major on international relations. I'm not expertise on nuclear weapons or CTBTO, so maybe I would like to raise some silly questions.
No questions silly.
Okay, we all are witnessing the power shifting from the west to the east and the fast-changing landscape of the Indo-Pacific region. So will the political changes have any implication to the CTBTO in the future? And the second question is that I myself feel a little bit unfair when I read Article 1 on basic obligations. I feel that countries, those already possessed nuclear weapons, now want to prevent those who wants to possess nuclear weapons. Is it right? And why the US and China haven't ratified the CTBTO? Thanks.
Okay, so there were three questions. First, the impact of the power shift from the west to the east on the CTBT. Well, I can only say from what I observe in here, so far as the member states of the current Preparatory Commission are concerned, I always just see a high degree of support for the treaty and for the Preparatory Commission. If there is any power shift there, I really don't observe them in so far as the proceedings of the meetings of the Preparatory Commission, and so far as the relationship between the member states and the current Preparatory Commission is concerned. Secondly, you said Article 1 of the treaty stands for an attempt made by the nuclear weapon states to prohibit the non-nuclear weapon states from conducting any tests. Is that right? So I don't think you are suggesting that some non-nuclear weapon states are planning to conduct nuclear tests and they regard that ban as unfair. Is that right? There's nothing here in Article 1 that suggests that only the non-nuclear weapon states are prohibited from conducting nuclear tests. It says each state party. Remember, there's only, by terms of the NPT, there's only 5 nuclear weapon states. They certainly don't represent the each state party reference here. So, I beg to differ. In my view, Article 1 here does not stand for an attempt on the part of nuclear weapons, for the simple reason that there's no reference here to nuclear states and nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. And as for the third question, why the US and China have not yet ratified the treaty, well, they may do so tomorrow. This is the nature of international politics. Things would change overnight. All I can say is that they still have not yet ratified the treaty today. But tomorrow, you never know, they would. That's why I'm always, and I remain, optimistic about this. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Stephen Herzog. I'm from the United States. And my question is about states parties. And currently through the IDC Secure Web Portal, the International Data Center is making available the raw and process IMS data to all states parties, which appears to currently be defined as state signatories who are interested in the data. So my question is about how the concept of states parties changes or does not after entry into force. And that is to say, is a non-Annex II state that has signed but not ratified the treaty after it enters into force still a state party to the treaty after entry into force? Could it legally continue to receive the IMS data through the IDC or even call for an OSI without having ratified? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So there's a number of questions contained in your question here. First of all, the concept of a state party. The concept of a state party only becomes applicable when the treaty has actually entered into force. Then you would have this notion of states parties to that treaty. Before that happens, we have signatory states or ratifying states, but we don't yet have states parties simply because the treaty has not yet entered into force. So at the current stage, which is the stage of the Preparatory Commission, again, the resolution establishing the Preparatory Commission is also contained in this booklet. If you can all turn to page 124. And if you look at paragraph 4 of that resolution, you read, "The Commission shall be composed of all states which sign the treaty." These are the current members of the Preparatory Commission. That's why we refer to them as state signatories, not as states parties. The current Preparatory Commission is composed of all the states that have signed the treaty. And because the current IMS data and IDC products are provided by the Preparatory Commission to all these members of the Commission, so we don't yet use the concept of a state party. So the currently Preparatory Commission provides data to the state signatories, who are at the same time, by virtue of the resolution, members of the Preparatory Commission. So in the future, of course, under the treaty, the data are provided to all the states parties. Then, unless a state is a state party, then that state will no longer be able to receive data under the treaty. That's what I mean. Even if that state may have been able to receive data under the resolution. After a period, upon the entrance into force, the Preparatory Commission shall cease to exist, and the resolution establishing the PrepCom shall cease to operate, and the treaty regime will kick in. By that time, everything will be done in strict accordance with the treaty. Okay, I see that we've already... Okay, please, last question. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, and I see the title of the presentation is Understanding the CTBT, and definitely when we talk about understanding whatever treaty, we must definitely talk about the subject. So my question might sound rather simple, if not silly, but still, what is a nuclear test, and what is actually the amount of energy to be released that we should consider a test as a nuclear test? And what about hydronuclear tests or computer simulations, for instance? Should we also consider them as nuclear tests or nuclear weapon tests? Thank you.
Good, thank you. In this respect, I'm referring you to Article 1 of the treaty. Now we read, each state party undertakes not to carry out any nuclear weapon test, explosion, or any other nuclear explosion. That is what is banned under this treaty. It has to be an explosion to be banned by the treaty, if you follow the strict terms of the treaty. So there might be different ways of defining what a nuclear test means. But as far as I am concerned, as a lawyer working for this treaty, what is banned under this treaty is a nuclear weapon test, explosion. So that does not include computer simulations, of course, because it is not an explosion. And again, the treaty does not specify the energy release of a nuclear test explosion. Any nuclear test explosion is banned by the treaty.
And what about hydronuclear explosions?
No, if it is a nuclear test explosion, then it is banned by the treaty. Okay, thank you very much. And so we can continue our discussion afterwards and in the course of the whole next 2 weeks. You know who I am, and I'm sure my colleagues will help you find me. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Xiaodong. I think we heard a number of similar questions coming up as during the previous presentation. So you can see, I think, how very closely related the legal aspects of the treaty are to the politics of the treaty, in a sense. Some people asked why certain countries still haven't gone forward with their ratifications. Some people asked if this meant that there was a different class of state established by the treaty. As I mentioned earlier, and as also Xiaodong mentioned, the CTBT doesn't discriminate between states. Maybe some other treaty regimes do. But it is an open question as to why some countries that do possess nuclear weapons have not yet completed their ratifications. We touched on it a little bit during my presentation earlier, but I would encourage you to keep that in mind, especially during some of the panel discussions in the next few days where we look in more detail at some of those countries. So without further ado, I'd like to move on to the last of today's sessions, which will be on the Preparatory Commission and the future organization. And so I'd ask if he's here in the room. Yes, he is. The esteemed Mr. Bozorgmehr Ziaran, who is Protocol and International Cooperation and also the Secretary to the Preparatory Commission. So Reza, if you wouldn't mind taking to the podium. Certainly can.
Thank you. I'm a horrible speaker and a presenter, so I don't know what to say. So you're going to help me with my presentation. Okay. We start with the current organization, the Preparatory Commission, the first slide, the next one. It was established by a UN General Assembly resolution. Ambassador Hoffman is here, the veteran of the negotiations and the first executive secretary of the organization. Okay, thank you. It's the organization established in 1996, 19 November, and it's important, it's very important. The resolution recognizes the Commission, Preparatory Commission for CTBTO as an international organization. It has the status of an international organization. That is very important as we proceed further. The terms of reference, or the terms of reference for the organization, let me then ask you, if you have an organization, what are the terms of reference? Who knows? Yeah.
What is this expected to do? What is expected of it? What is going to do?
Exactly. But what is your terms of reference? The first thing is the treaty. The second is the resolution that established the organization. Then you have other documents, rules of procedure of every international organization, which applies to the meetings of the governing bodies of those organizations. And then the decisions taken by the governing bodies or the organization. And lastly, the practice. With the Commission, it's very easy to be the secretary of the governing bodies because you have a very, very precise and very short rules of procedure. Not too much details in it, so it's easy to remember all the rules. But then it's a challenge because there are many practices that you have to recall. Which year, what situation, what was the decision? And most of these decisions are not reflected in the reports of the Commission. The reports of the Commission are very brief. For example, if a decision is taken to extend the observer status to a regional organization, so you have to know when that decision was taken. What context? European Union as the Commission, not as the presidency, but the Commission wanted to become an observer. So there was lots of discussions at the extended bureau meeting. So the decision was that there's no any point bringing it to the full house, so the extended bureau can decide that. European Union can attend the meetings of the Commission as an observer. So, but the decision is there and never reflected in the report, so you have to keep the track. So that's why it's important to have the records of the practices, or the practice is important for as a terms of reference, because when we had another country like Cuba, which is not hosting in accordance with the resolution establishing the commission, and the rules of procedure, only those countries who's going, non-signatory states who are going to host or will host or are hosting the facilities, IMS stations or facilities of the organization, future organization can be observers and attend meetings of the Commission and the subsidiary bodies as observers. But then in case of Cuba, Cuba will not host any IMS facilities. So what would be the decision? There is nothing in the rules of procedure to that effect. So the Commission makes a decision because that's the main decision body of the organization, whatever it decides. And I have said that when I was applying for the job, I was asked a question, but I would share it with you. And I answered that question. I believe that helped me to get the job. But it was very much related to situations where you don't have anything in rules of procedure or the resolution establishing the Commission or the previous decisions of the Commission or the practice. Okay. So what is the mandate of the PrepCom? The mandate of the PrepCom is to help the implementation of the treaty and prepare for the first conference of the state parties. There are lots of tasks to be accomplished for the first conference of the state parties. It's a long list. We have a project which is called Ishtar, which lists all these tasks that should be completed for the first conference of the state parties, and still it's going on. And we were supposed to finish it in 3 years, Ambassador Hoffman, because we were expecting to have the treaty enter into force in 3 years, and I would count. The functions of the Commission then is, in order to prepare for the effective implementation of the treaty, the first thing is to build up the verification regime of the treaty, and then operate it provisionally. Let me tell you here, it's really confusing sometimes, even for us. We call the main decision-making body of the organization, we call it Preparatory Commission, which is composed of all member states, and I will get to that. And then you call the whole organization also Preparatory Commission. It's confusing sometimes, but we would get to that, and I would try to explain it how that can be differentiated from one another. So again, other functions of the Preparatory Commission is to assist national implementation measures. Xiaodong referred to that. It's one of the obligations of the member states to implement certain activities or to undertake certain activities and implement certain measures that are called national implementation measures. And the PrepCom is supposed to assist the member states or the state signatories for their national implementation. Facilitate the ratification process. That's another activity that our legal section is or service that our legal section is providing. And prepare for the first conference of the state parties. So the Commission also supervises the activities of the Secretariat and considers and adopts the annual budget of the organization. That's where we get the commission and its subsidiary bodies. The best thing is the whole organization, as you see right now, is the Preparatory Commission, which is the main decision-making body of the organization, consisting of 183 state signatories. And then you have we call that decision-making body, it's called plenary, but it's, again, in the documents and everywhere else, you see the plenary as the Preparatory Commission. And the whole organization is called, again, Preparatory Commission for Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And as far as decision-making bodies are concerned, or the governing bodies, you have the Preparatory Commission, and then you have Working Group A, which deals with budgetary, administrative, and also legal issues, and Working Group B, which deals with verification-related activities. And then we have an advisory group composed of some experts which are appointed in their own personal capacities and serve as an advisory board on matters related to financial and budgetary issues. Not only administrative issues are covered by them that are related to financial and budgetary matters. And that's one of the controversial issues sometimes about the turf between, or the turf of advisory group member or advisory group. And the mandate of these bodies, which are intergovernmental bodies, or it's the, here you have all the states who decide, and the advisory group is just to provide advice to member states. And then we have provisional technical secretariat and the verification regime. This is the current structure of the organization. And as I said and mentioned before, 183 state signatories are members of the organization. So the observers are non-state signatories hosting IMS stations, and then other states upon decision of the Commission. If the Commission decides, it's the, I mean, as I said in the case of Cuba, then they would invite other states to join as observers. And then we have United Nations and entities standing invitations to participate at UN General Assembly. This one was subject of 5 years of negotiations to actually revise Rule 5 of the Rules of Procedure in order to allow for certain entities, in particular Palestine, to be or represented at the Commission as an observer entity. And then UN specialized agencies, intergovernmental organizations, and organizations having relationship agreement with the Commission, including WMO and UNIDO, IAEA, and the UN itself. So the mandate of the then PTS, as we call it, Provisional Technical Secretariat, is to assist the Commission in its activities, and it's composed of an executive secretary and the divisions, and we have an oversight, internal oversight. So the budget since 2002, the budget, our budget is a zero real gross budget. and that has not changed. But we see an increase in extra budgetary resources of the organization, which is voluntary contributions, and it's a matter of sometimes discussions at the PrepCom, because some member states are saying that most of the activities of the organization should be financed through regular budget and in particular capacity building activities. And then we have a general fund, I mean the budget, a regular budget, then would be general fund and capital investment fund. Capital investment fund is for verification system of the organization. And then we have recently established 4 multi-year funding, multi-year funds. So it's called multi-year funding modalities, where we can actually park some financial resources for bigger and multi-year activities. Actors, the main actors first and foremost are states. I mean, it's with the Commission, it's not only the states, but it's all the stakeholders have a role to play. It's state signatories, the Secretariat itself, IMS station operators are involved in our activities so much, I mean science and technology, workshops that they attend and they contribute and they benefit from the exchange of knowledge, experience, and recent developments. And then national data centers, scientific communities, as we have these science and technology conferences, so which is held regularly. But the most important thing is that all the decisions of the Commission and the organization are taken by consensus. There's only one decision which is not taken by consensus, but that is finally taken by consensus. Ambassador Hoffman, what is that one? Yeah, that's the appointment of the executive secretary. But then, that one, after a decision is almost, I mean, when you have the consensus, then after the voting or so, then the appointment comes by consensus. Although there has been a voting to identify the leading candidate who enjoys the 2/3 majority. After that, we never mentioned that, who got the first vote or so, but we would say that the executive secretary was appointed by consensus. So all the decisions of the Commission are taken by consensus. It takes time, it's sometimes frustrating. For example, when we wanted to have some vice chairs, I'm saying it's very simple, there's rules of procedure and the structure of the organization. We didn't have vice chairs for the subsidiary bodies. We had a chairperson for Working Group A, a chairperson for Working Group B, but no vice chair. If a chairperson would not be able to perform his function, then we had a situation. You had to find somebody who would chair the meeting in the absence of the chair. And sometimes the chairperson of the Commission, which is a higher body, would chair the meetings of a subsidiary body until the chairperson would be able to come and continue his or her own functions. And right now we are facing the same situation. We don't have a chair for Working Group A. And then the vice chair also cannot come and preside over the meetings of Working Group A. So the decision is that the chairperson of the Commission would chair until the Commission would appoint a new chair for that subsidiary. So that simple notion that a subsidiary body should have, the subsidiary bodies of the Commission should also have some vice chair, and then the procedure for that took 3 years of negotiations. Not easy. But at the end, it's good because all the decisions are taken by consensus. So you need to have the life of Noah to not to lose heart and achieve what you're looking for. But anyhow, it's one of the advantages of this organization that the decisions are taken. So entry into force. So as the negotiation was going on, there was a euphoria, almost, not that much, but there was optimism that the treaty would enter into force in almost 3 years. And it's written in the treaty. It's not what I'm saying. Who knows where you can find the reference to 3 years in the treaty that the yeah, exactly. It says that it comes with a contingency plan. If the treaty does not enter into force in 3 years, then the depository would call for a conference of states, ratifying states, to discuss ways and means of promoting the entry into force of the treaty. So that's in the treaty. Because they expected that the treaty would enter into force in 3 years. But there might be some odds, then, okay, it didn't happen by 2000 almost. So then Article 14 conference, the provision was initiated, and the first conference was held in 1999. And since then, every other year we have had another conference and another conference and another conference, and discuss ways and means of promoting the entry into force of the treaty. The last one was in 2017, the 10th Article 14 conference in New York. It used to, alternate between Vienna and New York, but in the last couple of conferences it has been held in New York for certain reasons, because it's held during the General Assembly, that high level week, so you have more foreign ministers and other high-ranking officials from the state signatories who might participate in the conference. So that's one of the arguments in favor of holding the Article 14 conferences in New York. So there's another initiative actually by some other countries. It started by Australia, Japan, and the Netherlands, and then it was supported by Canada, Germany, and Finland. Now it has 6 almost co-organizers of the ministerial meeting of the Friends of the CTBT. That is held in the year that we don't have Article 14 conferences. Article 14 conferences are held in odd years, while the ministerial meeting of the Friends of CTBT are held in even years. And 2018 September, most probably on 18 September 2018, there would be the next ministerial meeting of the Friends of the CTBT. All the states are invited to attend, but it's a very shorter and briefer, with a one-page almost declaration rather than, or a statement rather than the Article 14, which is subject to negotiations, and everybody puts it like Christmas tree, everybody contributes and adds to the elements in the final declaration of Article 14. Okay, transformation, but what so far I told you whatever about the organization and the trigger point, the current organization, which is the Commission, and then now the trigger point, which would be entry into force, and the efforts in order to achieve this entry into force. So let's assume that tomorrow the last instruments of ratification by Annex 2 states are deposited. Then what would happen? Then, no, but it doesn't enter into force. You need 180 days after the deposit of the last instruments of ratification. And then, from that moment, the Secretary General, as the depository of the treaty, has to hold the first conference of the state parties. When the first conference of the state parties is held, which means 30 days, let's say, 30 days, and then 180 days, it's 210 days after the last deposit or the deposit of the last instruments of ratification, then you have the new organization, which will be called CTBTO. The mandate is just similar to what we have for the Commission. Yeah? It's to achieve the purpose, object and purpose of the treaty, and ensure implementation of the treaty, providing a forum for consultations and cooperation amongst the state parties. That's very important we get to this. So main organs would be the Conference of the State Parties. That's the highest decision-making body of the future organization. That would meet every year, like OPCW, those who have the experience of OPCW, because CTBT actually was negotiated mainly by those who negotiated the CWC, Chemical Weapons Convention. So the model was, even the Preparatory Commission was a bit copied from what we had for CWC. Ambassador Hoffman can confirm that. A Conference of the State Parties that is composed of all the state parties to the treaty. And then Executive Council, which would have 51 members, and then Technical Secretariat. Then you don't call it PTS, you call it TS. So you save a P, and as far as the abbreviation is concerned, and which includes the International Data Center. So it's the same. Instead of the Commission, you have the Conference of the State Parties, Executive Council, and the Executive Council might establish subsidiary bodies for itself, Technical Secretariat, and verification regime. Okay, somebody should tell me now that what are the differences between this organization and the current organization in accordance with the treaty.
You have the right to carry out the onsite inspection, and because the treaty is entered into force.
Exactly. Yeah, that's one of the biggest differences. Yeah. Again, what else?
They can make amendments to the treaty.
Exactly, but that is correct as well. We get to that as well. But there are certain things that you also, yeah.
Right now, we don't have the conference of the state parties, but the future one will have the conference of the state parties after the treaty enters into force.
Yes, exactly. Now we have the commission, which is composed of all the state signatories. We don't have any executive council or so. Yeah, you're right in the sense that you have all the states, also the conference of the state parties. Functions would be different from the functions and mandate of the executive council. Now it's just one. There are other activities. That they might come, because even OPCW has scientific and it has also it has an advisory group. It's called ABAF something, Advisory Group for Budgetary and Administrative Issues, something, ABAF, yeah, it's. So, confidence building measures, yeah. The future organization, with the future organization, you have that option. With the future organization, you have consultations before requesting an on-site inspection, you have consultation and clarification. Those are the elements that we have, but that's for later. It comes later. But let's see. The conference of the state parties, it would have annual sessions, as I told you, and also special sessions, amendment conference and review conference 10 years after the entry into force. The treaty bans all nuclear explosive tests, but it also allows for the possibility of conduct of nuclear tests, explosive tests. Who can tell me that? You can find it in the treaty. It's in Article 8 of the treaty. There's a possibility of conducting nuclear explosive, underground nuclear explosive tests, provided that the review conference concludes it's necessary. And then there's an amendment which would be adopted by an amendment conference to the treaty that would allow for conduct of underground nuclear testing. But there was a political reason for that you have not discussed yet the negotiations on CTBT. Okay, there was a political reason for that, and the reason that provision was put in the treaty was to secure the agreement of one of the states, one state, which was against the treaty. Unfortunately, that state didn't jump on board. Ambassador Hoffman, you know, Ambassador Bush, unfortunately, she passed away, otherwise she would provide more insight on this provision. But anyhow, so it's the special sessions, the conference of the state parties would also have some special sessions. The special sessions of the conference of the state parties would be held when decided by the conference, when requested by the executive council, or requested by a state and supported by a majority of the state signatories. And it should be held, when it's requested, it should be held in, how much time do I have? 5 minutes or so? Yeah? Okay. It should be held no later than 30 days after the realization of each of these foregoings. So we discussed that, the Executive Council, and then the mandate, all these tasks that should be prepared for the first conference of the state parties. I will share with you these details. Okay. And that's PrepCom vis-a-vis the conference of the state parties. I asked, of the CTBTO and the PrepCom. I asked, and you rightly mentioned one of the biggest differences, and then consultations, as I said, and clarifications that you cannot have it right now, but when you have the future organization, that could be. Then collective measures by member states. Xiaodong was referring to violation of,
There is another difference. I think that's the provisional technical secretariat. After entry into force the organization, then it's not provisional anymore.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly. It would be the technical secretariat, and then referral to the United Nations. If there's a violation, then either the Executive Council or the Conference of the State Parties can refer the case to the UN. And confidence building measures, and it's this one that also you should be considering. I mean, collective measures. It's not that always only that the future Executive Council or Conference of the State Parties would refer a violation to the UN. They might collectively also undertake measures. I'm moving so much to the left and right, sorry for that. I cannot speak without movement. And then, okay, this is a question that I always ask. Does it matter whether the treaty enters into force? I mean, as we argue that we have an international norm, established international norm against nuclear testing.
Yes, it does. Actually, when the treaty enters into force, an international norm like prohibition of nuclear tests will enter into force, de facto and de jure, both. Yeah, exactly. So now it's kind of like it is recognized, but not as legally binding, just simply, everybody adopted it. But when the treaty enters into force, it will be a binding norm, and the CTBTO will just check the compliance with this norm.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. But let me play it differently. We say that I'm trying to play the trumpet from the wrong side of it. It's a very difficult then situation you would see. If trumpet, you would try to blow in a trumpet from the other side. The wrong side of it. But that might be interesting. I believe as far as the organization is concerned, as far as the Secretariat is concerned, we're doing absolutely what we would be doing when the treaty would enter into force. We would maintain our verification system, all the IMS facilities that we have, laboratories and so on and so forth. We would sustain them. We would recapitalize them in terms of technology, in terms of equipment and all these things. We would receive data, we would process data, and we would share it with member states. That's what we would do. So, even I was telling you a question that I was asked when I applied for this job. The question was this: just assume that there's a nuclear test tomorrow. Then there's a request that the Preparatory Commission would dispatch an on-site inspection team, and the country who is suspected of conducting the nuclear test accepts to receive an OSI mission. So, what would be the Security Council has decided to ask the Preparatory Commission, but the treaty says on-site inspection can be conducted only after the entry into force of the treaty. So what would be your advice to the head of the organization then, as the secretary of the PrepCom? So the Security Council has made a decision, has requested the Commission to dispatch an on-site. The country,
if I'm not mistaken, the country must provide the consent to receive
yeah,
this.
I'm saying that
if the country objects to this on-site inspection.
Let's say that this is Lala Land or Lala Republic. Yeah, Lala Republic has decided that yes, I want to receive, because I have conducted, I want to be recognized as a nuclear state. Yeah, why not? I'm ready to receive an OSI mission, and the Security Council has decided and requested it. So I said, the resolution establishing this organization, because we don't have that much time, what I said is this organization is an independent international organization. The Security Council cannot decide for this organization. Yeah. Its membership is different from the UN membership and all this. But it has a body, which is Commission, which makes all the decisions. If the Commission decides to ask the head of the organization to send an on-site inspection, then it's up to, it's a mandate for the head of the organization to send that on-site inspection mission. So it's what I said, and I believe they accepted my answer.
Can I just ask you a quick question? If you go to the chart, the organization chart of the United Nations, there's a kind of like a column, related organizations, and the CTBTO is in this list of related organizations. What kind of status does a related organization have in this organizational chart of the United Nations? Is it supposed to report to the Security Council? Or like you've just said, it's like independent, autonomous?
We have a cooperation agreement with the United Nations that we can report, we can attend the meetings of the UN, and then we can present our report, and they can also attend our meetings and be present. But when it comes to the Security Council, matters are become a bit political. It's not simply like first committee of the UN that we have this practice of going and presenting a report, the executive secretary making statements also. When it comes to the Security Council, then the other political factors would play into this. There are maybe certain members who have not ratified yet the treaty. They might not want this issue to be, that the head of this organization to present any report to that also. But anyhow, I can mention the previous tests conducted by DPRK. The last 3 ones, we held meetings before the Security Council, and then the Commission condemned all the, in the strongest language, or in strongest word, condemned the nuclear test conducted by DPRK, and after that the Security Council also met. I'm saying we didn't refer anything to the Security Council because it's not yet the future organization, and either Executive Council of the future organization or the Conference of the State Parties that can refer the matter to the Security Council, to the UN, not to the Security Council, to the UN for its consideration. That word, the UN, as Xiaodong was saying, why not Security Council and the UN? That was also part of the negotiations in order to, part of the negotiations on the treaty in order to keep everybody happy with the draft and secure the ratification of the treaty by all those countries. Those ratifications very important for the entry into force of this treaty. But anyhow, let's go back to what would be ratification and the established norm. The established norm, it's when you're talking about law, norms vis-a-vis law, a law is an adopted rule of its, that its violation would lead to some certain penal actions. There's an enforcement for that, as you rightly mentioned. But then norms are the accepted standard behavior. If you violate them, then it's morally wrong, but there are no any penalty foreseen for violation of the norms which are accepted as standard behaviors. So any questions? Yes?
Hi, Reza.
Hi.
Thank you very much for that. I'm Pedro. I'm with the Brazilian Permanent Mission here in Vienna. My question to you is just wanted to get your point of view on a specific issue that's usually brought up here and sometimes in discussions regarding, I believe it's Article 7 of the Annex of the resolution, which says that the PrepCom has standing as an international organization. And what does that mean in legal and practical terms in being an international organization? And if there is any difference, what would they be? Thank you.
When you're, in practical terms, what we usually use this in order to ask for taxes. I'm saying usually it's the main issue for the time being. Because there are certain countries that which do not recognize us as an international organization. So whatever we send for IMS facilities in terms of equipment or so, then there are taxes that are levied on the organization. and then all the member states are paying for that. It's over I'm saying couple of millions so far we have paid for that. And there are certain countries where when you want to go, then you cannot go as an international civil servant. You have to go as the national of your own country. Yeah. And then you pay fees for visas, and the organization pays that for you. Yeah. Yes, yes.
Thank you. If I could go back just for a second to the 10-year review conference and what might happen there. As I recall, what could happen is that there could be a proposal to make a provision for nuclear explosions for peaceful purposes,
yes.
Not for weapons purposes.
No, for peaceful purposes.
For peaceful purposes, and that this was something that was agreed to because of the views of the People's Republic of China, not of India. And as well, the provision requires that that kind of amendment be adopted by everybody. Yeah. So at least I think from the perspective of many states, this is not likely to be something that's going to happen.
Exactly. I'm not saying that it's going to happen, but I said that in that it's for people to, I wanted to sharpen people's eyes on this point. It's not that it's going to happen tomorrow and everybody would agree, but in the treaty which bans all nuclear explosive tests, it's also considered the possibility of having some, but for peaceful purposes. And then it's like the guy who was saying that, look, we want to have a couple of warheads for peaceful purposes. Yes.
Is there any legal?
Sorry. Yeah, you first.
Thank
and
you.
then you. Yes, sir.
I have a question. I'm Çiğdem from Turkey. I'm a social scientist, so I'm not very informed. I have a question about the transition from the Commission to the actual CTBTO. So, according to the Annex, and as you say, the Commission will disappear, but there will be a smooth transition. So, what will happen to you, and can you talk more about this smooth transition?
I would go to retirement. No, I'm joking. But all the staff of the organization and all the assets of the PrepCom would become the staff and assets of the future organization. In addition to that, and then only the nationals of ratifying states can serve as the staff of the future organization. Let's say that I'm coming from Iran, but Iran is an Annex to the state. Its ratification is required for entry into force. Let's say that I'm coming from Lala Republic, sorry. Lala Republic. I'm coming from Lala Republic, and my country has not ratified the treaty, but the treaty enters into force. So as a staff of the organization now, I cannot be the staff of the future organization. So I go for retirement. Yes, sorry.
Well, actually, I've got two questions. Well, question number one, I wonder if there is a legal definition of a peaceful tests, like what is meant by tests conducted for peaceful purposes. Is there any legal definition of such a test? How can you see the difference, whether it is for military applications or for peaceful purposes?
That's very, very difficult to ascertain that a nuclear explosive test or explosion test would be peaceful, but then that's up to the review conference to be convinced in any way that it's for peaceful purposes. And then the request would be to hold, or a decision to hold an amendment conference to amend the treaty in order to allow for that. It's almost close to impossible, but the possibility is there if they can prove. I mean, we don't know. I mean, maybe in future there would be more, more reasons or more purposes for which would be civil and scientific purposes, or I'm not a scientist. I cannot imagine any peaceful purposes for a nuclear detonation.
And actually, my second question, you have described the future CTBTO, okay? What is the future of the youth group when the CTBT enters into force? Will it change the status of the youth group? Will it have some privileges, or I don't know?
These are initiatives that are not part of the organization, and I'm certain that when this organization, when the treaty enters into force, just one person would lose certainly his job or her job. That's the executive secretary, whoever he or she is, would lose his job or her job, because then it becomes, except if he or she would run for the head of the organization. Otherwise, then one of the reasons let me take you back to 10 years ago and then come back here, because Ambassador Hoffman is here and I cannot lose the opportunity. Ambassador Hoffman, for 8 years, his mandate was renewed annually. You also recall, no? Every year. Every year. It was not like now that, or it started with Ambassador Tibor thought that the first appointment was made for 4 years. Before that, everybody would say that, okay, in 1 year it might enter into force, another year it might enter into force, for 8 years. And the executive secretary was appointed, renewed his mandate, except for the first time that you were appointed. Then it was renewal of the appointment of the executive secretary for 7 consecutive years after. But it's all these initiatives, it depends. I mean, these are the youth group, CTBT youth group is initiative of Dr. Zerbo, the executive secretary, or GEM, group of eminent persons also. These are not part of the organization now, and they are not part of the organization in the future. I hope that all the youth group members would stay young before the entry into force of this treaty. Yeah, stay young and keep young, and then that would come. I mean, nobody knows what would the future hold for us. I mean, maybe it would be ratification of the treaty by DPRK, and then followed by the US, Iran, China, Israel also. Maybe that we need a trigger point. The push, or triggering. Any other questions? No? Sorry for the boring presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Reza, for sharpening our eyes, as you said. This brings us to the end of the first day of the symposium. Thank you all for bearing with us so far. Just a couple of things to mention. Tomorrow we will not be in this room. For most of the rest of the symposium, we will be on the 4th floor of this building in boardroom C, which is a larger room as well. So please make your way there tomorrow morning when the first session starts at 9 a.m., not at 10 a.m. like today. Tomorrow we will start with a very interesting panel discussion looking back on the negotiations, as we already discussed. We will also have a session on why states test, and another panel discussion on the consequences of nuclear testing. Then after lunch we will move into the presentations and discussions on the verification regime. One further thing I'd just like to mention is that there will be a side event taking place at lunchtime tomorrow, which is being organized by the Permanent Mission of the Russian Federation, and that will be in this room. And the title of that side event is CTBT, Critical Steps to Facilitate the Treaty's Entry into Force. And the Permanent Mission is also kindly providing some food in advance of that, and I'm assured that there will be some Russian delicacies available for those that want to partake of that. And that small reception will be just outside the conference room here. One last thing to mention, if you wouldn't mind having a look at the sign-up sheets that are posted on the doorways on either side of me here. And you can check to see if your names are included for the visits to the Atom Institute next week and also for the Executive Council simulation. So with that, thank you very much. Have a pleasant evening and we'll see you all tomorrow.